Beware the yeast of the Pharisees. That is their hypocrisy. Jesus, whom many of us follow as a power of example, is said to have spoken these words when he was speaking to the multitudes in Luke chapter 12, verse 1. I love using the New Testament, not from the concept that this is the undeniable word of God, but from an understanding that it was written by first century Jewish male writers as they shared their cultural beliefs and behaviors. And then I love analyzing the possible meanings for those writers back in their time period and seeing if there is an application for us to use in the 21st century. According to some scholars, the word Pharisees means separated ones. And during their time period, the Pharisees were the priests who performed all the rituals for cleansing and atonement for the Jewish people to be in God's good grace. They kept to themselves to be able to obey the very rigid purity laws. They were a prominent religious sect during the first century. They were influential and prided themselves on being righteous. And you know what? They loved money, conspicuousness, and they loved titles. They were so biased in their application of the law that it became a burden for the people to adhere to or comply with these laws. The Pharisees, they had lost sight of the spirit of the law. Charles Fillmore, our co-founder of Unity, describes the Pharisees in his book, The Revealing Word, which of course is one of the tools that we use for metaphysical interpretation of terms. And he says, Pharisees means lacking in understanding of the truth. Lacking in understanding of the truth, or hypocrites. You see, the Pharisees knew they were admired for their knowledge of God and feared for the punishment, justice they meted out to the Jewish people. The Pharisees probably enjoyed being admired by the community and looked to for leadership. Some of you may think, well, someone needed to know the rules and lead the community. And you know what? I do agree with you that leadership roles are important to a community's functioning. Yet, if someone becomes so identified with the role they perform, like that of a minister, they remain unconscious to the real self. They have become a false self. Just as the Pharisees looked good on the outside by conforming to the letter of the laws, there were lots of shadow aspects hidden within them. They lacked the understanding of wholeness. Jesus knew the Pharisees were invested in their roles as the authorities of Jewish law. In Matthew chapter 23, verses 25 and 27, Jesus is said to state this: "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and of the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside look beautiful, but inside they are full of the bones of the dead and of all kinds of filth." Isn't that a really powerful description? This, to me, is literature. When one reads these verses, it's easy to imagine how vile their insides could have been. Beware the yeast of the Pharisees. That is their hypocrisy. It's interesting to use the word yeast. We use yeast to change the property of something, such as dough or hops, right? The yeast permeates every cell of the base ingredient, molecularly changes the substance until it becomes something else. For example, if we add yeast to dough, it expands, right? It raises the dough to become bread. Or when added to hops, it ferments it into beer. Do the roles in your life define who you are? Do the roles help you to feel accomplished, successful, important, or give you a sense of belonging? Are these roles truly, truly what you have come here to this incarnation to be? Do any of those roles engender feelings of shame or disappointment or failure because you aren't living up to the expectation of others or yourselves? Who are we, especially if we let go of our roles? We entered this world knowing our truth, but may have forgotten them due to our focus on the things we have been indoctrinated to do or become. The need for belonging, conformity, and being a part of the culture is very strong. It's tribal. And this desire can lead us to live a double life. One of my favorite books is written by John Sanford, and it's entitled The Kingdom Within. And it describes the Pharisaic mask when he writes this: "The mask is the person we pretend to be, the false outer self, the false outer personality, which we turn to the world, but which is contradicted from within. It conceals our real thoughts and feelings, used so habitually as a way to hide from others and ourselves that we become unaware we have assumed it. There arises a gulf between the appearance and the reality. A certain falseness has taken us over. Beware the yeast of the Pharisees. That is their hypocrisy." So we've defined the Pharisees and we've defined yeast. Now let's look at the definition of the word hypocrisy. Of course, dictionary.com, I like to go to it, it's pretty easy, and they define hypocrisy as a pretense of having a virtuous character, a moral or religious beliefs that one does not really possess, a pretense of having some desirable or publicly approved attitude. In what areas are we acting on the outside, which is not the truth on the inside? I remember back in the day, way back, being on my own personal journey for becoming what I perceived as Christ-like. You see, in my previous way of thinking from my Christian framework, and it's a Catholic religious framework, to become Christ-like looks like this. I wouldn't swear. I would love everyone. I would be completely peaceful. There would be no sex unless I was married. And even being married, the sex would be devout sex. I wouldn't judge people. I wouldn't complain. I would be happy all the time. I would give all that I own to others. That's what I thought. And these expectations of me in the role of a Christian woman were unreachable. This meant if I couldn't live up to the expectations, then I would feel like a sinner, a failure, and inherently bad. What would other people think of me if they really knew what I thought, felt, or did? My saintly persona developed into a projection of my belief about what it should look like. Anything that I did that I felt wasn't holy would be hidden from others. And after doing that for a while, I started to hide it unconsciously from myself. Yet I could see my defects in others oh so clearly. There would be judgments of others because of their behaviors, judgments as I internally judged myself. At that time in my life, I wasn't being my truth. I wasn't living my truth. I was living as I thought I should within my Christian worldview. And let me tell you, I was exhausted because it takes so much energy to keep this false mask in place. Inside, I didn't feel spiritual or Christ-like. I felt a failure, unworthy, guilty, and filled with sin. It's in our need to belong that it can increase our desire to want to be part of and to matter to family and friends in our community or culture. And because of this need, we detract from the truth of who we really are. We may divide our activities into public and private, visible and unseen, but there is no such division in the kingdom within. I remember as a teenager, my mom saying to me to use my indoor voice when speaking. And this, in her eyes, was to prove to others that I was cultured and well-mannered. This instance meant my mom perceived me as too loud. But I really wasn't. I was just joyous and exuberant. Yet I learned to use this reserved mask with others. Sanford continues in his book, The Kingdom Within. The kingdom requires a depth morality, which penetrates through the outer shell of a man to his heart. This heart is a synonym for the unconscious. It is when we consciously accept the inner world that the possibility for wholeness emerges, end quote. Sanford is talking about embracing wholeness is how we find the kingdom within, coming to terms with all aspects of ourselves, the parts of us that we think are wonderful, as well as those we may have judged to be unworthy or not of good. All parts of ourselves are needed to be whole, the light and the shadow. The loud, exuberant part of me is vital to my wholeness. It helps me to not take life or myself so seriously. Our purpose is to discover the kingdom is within us. And how do we do that? By embracing all aspects of ourselves. As we discussed earlier, a little yeast slowly permeates and transforms hops. So too will our hiding from our whole true self permeate and create a false self. If we are committed to this false self, it is impossible to find the kingdom within. We need to be committed to uncovering the parts of ourselves that we think are bad or not of goodness, because those shadow aspects are there whether we like it or not. Our darkest feelings reside in our unconsciousness, and we try so hard to suppress them in the hopes that they will go away. But they don't go away. They remain in our unconsciousness. This means that who we really are will come to light, no matter how much we try to hide it. Because when we suppress something so long, it eventually comes out. And when it does, it can be in the most inappropriate ways and inappropriate times. We read daily about these people who suppress their shadow side into their unconsciousness and then have these extreme meltdowns. You know, the minister who is invested in their role as the holy minister and has the affair with the congregant, or the teacher who embodies the role of perfect teacher but abuses a student. In both cases, they are denying and suppressing the normal sexuality of being human. Or what about the student who goes on this killing rampage? Maybe he can no longer believe the role he plays and is unable to live up to the expectations of being an extraordinarily gifted student. You may think these are extreme cases, but how many times do we hear or read, they seemed so normal. I trusted them, and they were such a helpful and good person. All hypocrisy will be unmasked. Integrating all aspects of who we are is integral to uncovering our true purpose. The removal of the mask means looking at the shadow aspects of ourself. Once we embrace and love these shadow parts and shed light, we can then be whole and work from a higher level of consciousness. Removing the masks and the facades is vital for us to enter the kingdom within. And as Paul Selig, who I mentioned is an intuitive and has written several books, in his book, I Am the Word, to manifest the self as the Christ itself requires this mask that each of you wears. This false self that has said to you, I cannot be myself as my Christ itself, to fall apart and dismantle once and for all, end quote. So as I end this discussion for the moment, I remind you, the kingdom of heaven is within us. There is no need to go searching outside of ourselves to try to reach it. We are the sacred temples. And once we shed light, the feared enemy within us is no longer powerful. The integration and love of all that we are is who we have come here on this planet to be. I see you. I see who you truly are, both the light and the shadow. The light and the shadow are both holy. You are a divine being. Your purpose is to awaken to that truth. All aspects of you are divine. And this is how we transform into something greater. Let's do that together.